Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. What we will do today is launch this book that has been available a month now, I think, or 3 or 4 weeks. And we will have, with a few people who know the work of Koolhaas quite well, we'll have a conversation. But as an introduction, I will introduce to you the book and also introduce a bit I think remarkable relationship our school or people related to our school have had with Rem Koolhaas. These are two covers of Lotus International, an Italian journal. Luca Ortelli was part of the editorial team, so he was also responsible at the beginning of the 80s for, let's say, putting the work of OMA Rem Koolhaas at front stage of architectural culture. Of course, Jacques Lucan, who has taught theory here for many years, was the editor of one of the first, let's say, independent books on the work of OMA Rem Koolhaas in 1991, a book that was published in French but soon also translated in German and English. And since I think the Italian edition of the book by Roberto Gargiani was published in 2006, and the English edition has been republished recently. So there is a kind of Koolhaas tradition here at EPFL. I have invited some people that have also a link with OMA and Rem Koolhaas, but that are not part, or that were at least, well, they were already born in the period that the book deals with, but they are not present in the book as, let's say, contributors. So one of them is Véronique Patteeuw, who also is was the editor of this important book, What is OMA, in 2004, that was published on the occasion of actually the more or less the for now the last exhibition Koolhaas curated on the work of OMA. This is one of my first, I must say, one of the reasons I made this book is also to try to, I mean, Koolhaas has been, when I started out as an architecture student, has been very important during my education, and this book is also a way of trying to find a kind of closure in that relationship. What was an important moment in, actually, you could say almost the first version of this book, was an issue of OASE I edited together with Véronique also in 2015, in which we sort of presented a new look on the first decade of OMA, so actually more or less the 80s. That was presented, we presented the issue together with Koolhaas and Job Floris in Rotterdam. But I think also the other people present in the conversation tonight have a specific bond with the work of OMA. So Véronique, like I said, edited several volumes on the work of Koolhaas. Sabine von Fischer contributed to the issue on the first decade we made in 2015 with a text on Furkablik. Kersten Geers with a text on the Netherlands Architecture Institute. So this is Furkablik. Véronique wrote a text in OASE on collages of OMA. Kersten on the Netherlands project of for the Netherlands Architecture Institute by OMA that unfortunately didn't get built, but that Kersten is actually building right now in Belgium. And then just a few words on the concept or the book itself. It's a critical reader, as the title says. What I have done is sort of the let's say the important voices in the book is not primarily the voice of Koolhaas, but the voice of the critic. So not of the architect, but of the more or less independent writer who tries to understand the activities and the production of OMA Rem Koolhaas. And I think that even if you like or whether you dislike or like the work of OMA, I think everyone will more or less agree that there has been important writing on this oeuvre, and that many of the protagonists of architectural thinking in the Western world during the last 3 decades have, let's say, sharpened their thoughts thanks to the activities of OMA. And in that sense, the book is also a kind of homage to what you could call in general the architectural writer. So the more or less, well, not always, but often not necessarily professionally involved as an architect, but a writer who decides to simply try to divest meaning and tries to enjoy architectural projects. So during last years, I've made a very more or less comprehensive bibliography of things that have been written about Koolhaas. In parallel, I collected, which is a kind of hobby of mine, you could say, magazine covers with projects by OMA in pole position. And then the decision was made to limit the book, literally bookend the book between Delirious New York and Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large. So the book, there is one exception, but the book opens with reviews of Delirious New York and ends with reviews of Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, and in between we have discussions, interpretations and commentary on different projects, but also on periods, on the production of a few years. So another criterion for selecting the text was that the text needed to be more or less contemporary. So they needed to be produced, let's say, maximum 1 or 2 years following the publication of the production of the projects and the book itself. The book is divided into 10 chapters. So we start with this small introduction or sort of ouverture about one particular project that Koolhaas made together with a student, and then in a sort of chronological order I collected reviews of, like I said, of Delirious New York, kind of periods, then also of separate buildings like the Dance Theatre in The Hague, Villa da Lava and the Kunsthal, and then the book concludes with reviews of the Euralil project and the concept of bigness that was often related to that project, and with small, medium, large, extra large and generic city. So it was a deliberate decision to not have a traditionally illustrated book. So the book opens with, I think, 20 pages of magazine covers, and afterwards it's only text. So it's a kind of a book to read rather than to look at, which is, I think, certainly the first book on OMA that exists in that way. Before we start the conversation, I would like to show 2 short film fragments that actually record. They're from Dutch national television, so they're from the National Archives of Dutch Television, and they sort of show 2 encounters between Koolhaas and his critics, or at least people who were asked to reflect upon his work. The first is a small film, so there are fragments in German, in Dutch, but so this is actually a television program or on the project for the City Hall in The Hague, for which was quite a polemical project, and for a long time, and that is what happened, it seemed that Richard Meijer was going to win the competition, so a lot of critics and intellectuals were mobilized exactly to take the defense of Koolhaas, and here you see Stanislaus von Moos and later on also Hubert Damisch defending the project.
Dan zou ik eigenlijk nog iets anders willen zeggen. Ik ben ook in een bepaalde mate een bewonderaar van Richard Meyer, maar ik vind de wereld heeft een paar heel belangrijke gebouwen van Richard Meyer, want we hebben nog geen belangrijk gebouw van OMA.
Don't you consider it strange that architects and people who professionally have to deal with architecture consider the design of Koolhaas as the best, and the authorities, the city authorities of The Hague, I think they prefer Richard Meyer's.
Well, they prefer Richard Meyer because they've seen a lot of that kind of architecture already. That it's there is a lot of publicity around that kind of architecture.
His name has
and of course, as you referred to it before, Richard Meyer architecture refers to the great tradition of Le Corbusier of the 30s. And so it's much more familiar as an image. The image of the architecture is much more familiar. When Rem Koolhaas is much more original.
De gemeente leek in eerste instantie nogal geporteerd voor het ontwerp van Richard Meyer. Is dat er verandering in is gekomen in de loop van de hele procedure?
Ik vind het heel moeilijk om te zeggen wie en wat de gemeente is. En ik gewoon voor mijn eigen gemoedsrust probeer ik me te onthouden van speculaties wat de gemeente vindt en hoe het met de gemeente gaat. Maar ik heb wel van het begin af aan... Kijk, de gemeente verwachtte natuurlijk van ons weinig meer dan een partijtje haastig in elkaar geflanst wrakhout. En ik heb in ieder geval mogen constateren dat toen we uiteindelijk aankwamen met wat we hadden, dat ze van verbazing openhangende monden soms vertoonden.
Yeah, sorry for the fact that it's in Dutch, but what Koolhaas actually said here is that so it shows the brutality of Koolhaas at the period, in the sense that he expressed the fact that the municipality, the mouths of the members of the municipality started opening spontaneously when they saw his project. And what Stanislas van Moos said in the beginning was that one of the reasons to select the project by Koolhaas would exactly be because the fact that the world didn't have at the time projects by Koolhaas, but there were already many buildings by Richard Meyer. This one is completely in English, and it's actually the final, the sort of the conclusion of a 30-minute documentary made on the occasion of the visit of Charles Jenks, so the famous historian and theoretician of postmodernist architecture. He was in '92 in the Netherlands to give a lecture, and he was of course shown around recent architecture. He visited the Kunsthal and he concluded his stay at the office of Koolhaas and OMA.
There is still a myth that modernity is a courageous position. In other words, in other words, and it's a kind of very paradoxical situation I am in, because in your eyes I'm presumably a modernist, but I really find this position here completely revolting, and the definition modernism without dogma is for me one of the most shocking non sequiturs and most repulsive concepts I know.
I can see your incredible frustration. I feel the vitality of what you're doing in the Kunsthalle. I see you using modern language, of course, modern industrial materials, but using it always to sort of cross out the modern phlegmatic dullness. So I get really excited.
Still, it's modern. It's a box. It's very straight.
It only uses a modern language. I mean, the classic postmodern thing is, of course, to get inside modernism and subvert it. I only fault it. My only critique is that you probably agree with me immediately, is that it's not soft enough. You need a soft architecture.
And in the car we said, well, there is hope because we have Rem Koolhaas. He has something that's good for the future, but he has to get rid of his modernism, doesn't he?
Rem doesn't have to get rid of his modernism. Rem has to go into his modernism and revitalize it and bring it alive. Of course, you know, modernism had hope in it. Modernism on its own, of course, is hopeless, but modernism revitalized has a place. I think that we're going to be in the modern world for another 100 years, and modernists have to do a lot better job of getting us through. And they shouldn't be the dominant. That's the real problem. I think, Rem, you might agree with me, do you?
Yeah. But let's go. We really have to go, because otherwise I have to drive like a maniac.
Okay, so that as a sort of introduction, if I can invite my friends to join me.
Is it on? Oh yes. Is it on?
I think there are no real rules for our conversation, so you can ask or suggest or tell anything you like. But as a sort of starting point, I ask you to select one text from the book, and possibly also one building or one project that you find important or that you have fond memories of. I think on a biographical level, I think all of us, we sort of grew up, well, me, probably it's even more true for you than for me, because I'm the youngest, but we all grew up with, literally with the work of its reception was very present during our education and our early professional years. So I was, well, one of the questions I was asking myself is what do you think when you see this book, and are there texts that are particularly surprising or unexpected?
Is it? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay.
Some seats in the front for the people in the back.
2, 4, 6, 7.
You want to escape?
There to come. Yes. Well, thank you first and foremost for having me here to talk about this quite impressive book, I must say. I did my architectural studies in Leuven, in Belgium, between 1992 and 1997. And it was indeed an important moment, being a student at that time at the university, at the moment when SML Excel was published. So all of a sudden, there was this kind of Bible, this gift, this incredible journey through a book and through the work of Koolhaas, who was both very far away and very close by, because we were able to go in and see him and see some of his projects. I think that this book is really a great gift to all of us, teachers, researchers, architects, architectural students, because it opens up a lot of writing that has been done on the work of OMA, and a lot of writing that has been done in other languages. I choose one text in Dutch that is translated in this book, which become available for a much larger audience. So that's one thing I think is very important. And the second thing is that I feel it is a kind of sequel of projects that I've been doing and that we have been doing together. When we made the OASE issue, we very clearly said to each other, and I think it was even your idea, Christophe, that we wanted to make a book not on Koolhaas as a researcher or as a theorist or as a writer, but on Koolhaas as an architect. And so we decided that this first decade of OMA and this issue of OASE was going to be dedicated to architectural projects, with few exceptions on methodologies. And the book that I made in 2004, when I was working in Rotterdam, was made on the occasion of the Contents exhibition, and was explicitly asked for by the Netherlands Architecture Institute as a book that was made on Rem Koolhaas as a researcher, as a theoretician, and seen from other disciplines than the discipline of architecture. So the people that we invited in 2004 in that book were people who were not related to the architectural profession themselves, but were architectural, no, not at all. They were literary critics, they were curators, there were people in other disciplines trying to grasp what the work of OMA was meaning at that time. And I think in this book, that's why I think it's so interesting, they come together. Because for me in this book there is both the kind of emblematic research by OMA, framed by these two important books. There are both the very important projects that were made and realized at that time. And if you scroll through the different contributors to the book, you can also see that from both the architectural critics, architectural theoreticians and historians, there are articles that you selected, but it's not only by them, if I'm correct. There are also people who come from other backgrounds. The thing that I would, very small criticism or more a question to you related to the book, is if it would have been interesting for us as readers to know a bit more about the context in which these articles were published, because of course we have a kind of small idea if we go and Google the magazine in which something was published, but we don't know the difference between somebody as Tracy Metz or Claude Parent or Liane Lefebvre. I was wondering if it was a kind of conscious decision on your behalf of not going into this background information.
Well, the book is separated in 10 parts, and each part has an introduction, and that was a way to I deliberately avoided to have a separate introduction for each text. Also because some of the texts were not long or substantial enough to merit that kind of separate introduction. So I can imagine there is so some of, well, you could say some of the context is given in the introductions to the 10 parts, but it's true that, well, it is a kind of book that also in terms of images that is offered as a kind of starting point. Mm-hmm. So if you want to know what a certain project looks like, there is always the possibility of finding it online, or if you want to know what a certain magazine looked like or what was published in a certain magazine, it's always the possibility of finding it out. But at the same time, I hope that a lot of the texts, or most of the texts, also still survive without this abundance of contextualizing information, exactly because they were written as direct reactions to a building or a book.
Mm-hmm. Which is true, and what I think is quite nice, if you start to be really interested in one project or one book or one building, and you start to read the different texts, you realize that there's so much discussion within the reception of the work that enables you to go further in the way how possibly the building was meant to be or analyzed by the public and by the audiences. And so the selection of very good appraisal for the building and very harsh critiques sometimes as well, I find it quite challenging to read it.
Oh yeah. So I studied during the same years as Véronique, and also have SML Excel on my shelf. And I think Koolhaas always had this aura that he was we were architecture students, and he was an architect who was more than that because he had been a journalist and a scriptwriter before. And at that, to me, that was always this aura of something that made him interesting. And now, as in the meantime, as of this year, I am also now a full-time journalist, and I'm still an architect, but I don't do architecture anymore. I work for the newspaper. So it has a different taste to me now, that he actually, the way he knows how texts work in the public sphere. And I think what is really interesting, how he uses them to actually trigger things. He does not control what is said about him, which in my experience happens like 90% of the architects that people I work with or myself write about. They want to see the text. They really want, like the typical architect basically wants to write the text himself and wants some style improvement, and I think Koolhaas really understands that discourse does something to architecture culture, and I'm not saying he's not controlling things. I think because he knows how the dynamics work. When he talks to Jenks, the first, like that was, I mean, like I've seen this the first time. Like in his opening statement, he completely takes control over what's happening. Jenks becomes this kind of, he's just the audience there, right? And just because Koolhaas is, the way he talks, he takes over completely, and by pretending to actually ask a question. So that is now, I find that very interesting, how he deals, how he uses discourse to propel his work. And in the book is amazing to read. Like I've never read this compilation in this density and diversity. And I think that you, like the sequence is your choice, is my guess. Like when I focus on the Kunsthal, a lot of them are in 1993. And I think the way you contrast them is also a story that actually you tell by the sequence, the order they're in. So that I found very interesting, just to see a range of what texts do, what texts want to do, how they achieve, how deep, how far they go, how deep they go, how broad how wide they are. But I think we go into detail later, yeah. So I think I'm also looking at from this perspective that he's more actually than a writer and an architect. He's really someone who understands a lot about the public sphere, how things are discussed.
I can, although I wonder what to add to all this. Well, it's of course a bit more of the same. I'm from the same generation. Well, maybe perhaps my relationship with the two books, even though I'm kind of roughly the same age, has always been slightly more conflicted. It's to say that I came, of course, far too late to be close to Delirious New York, but I decided I loved it, and SMXL was forever announced when I was a student, and then came when I was, I think, end of second year. And I decided to hate it from the day it came out. So, I mean, so of course that was a bit of a, how to say, a productive antagonism for me. And it took me a long time to kind of recover the book and, of course, look at it in a different way. Which brings me to a certain extent also to the way, at least, and I haven't read the full book, but I have been going through the book after you gave it to me, Christophe. I guess for the same reason I was endlessly, almost obsessively looking at the first 3 or 4 chapters, because I've always very much associated with this time, which of course is not my time, say the time before the Kunsthal in some sense, where you read an architect who still doesn't really exactly know how to build buildings, and people who don't really exactly understand how they have to read that weird character who's so arrogant that his arrogance somehow makes an easy acceptance of what he proposes often quite difficult. So I don't know. I mean, we come back to that later with what you choose or what you don't choose. But maybe to zoom out for a second, what I found remarkable is that, in some way, for me, I think it's a very beautiful book. I love it being a book without images. I think it's amazing how evocative the articles are. I mean, of course, I say that from the perspective of knowing his project. But I think in some sense, say his idea of the city, or his idea even of architecture in general, seems to be perfectly reconstructed in simply this, I would say, accumulation of opinions and text, which I thought was quite spectacular in this book. So you read, like, say, 5, 6 articles in a row, and I think in some way you manage to understand his I mean, especially at the time, insane idea of how conflict is, in a sense, or the kind of not resolving things is an engine in a design process. So I think for me, in that regard, and it to a certain extent even represented in the cover, I think the book is extremely successful. So I can, before we go deeper in the book, I can recommend everybody to now go and buy it immediately. Then, I don't know, Christophe, how you see this in terms of the fragment and the building or whatever, how we should bring this on the table. Is there a clear format?
Not really, but maybe one thing that Sabine said is intriguing and has to do with the fact that on the one hand Koolhaas sort of extremely controlled the reception of his work. There is one sentence from a recent interview that I quote in the introduction, in which he says that the major, I think he even calls it the major tragic problem of his life, is that his work has only been interpreted in his own terms, so that people have, which is, I think this book partly shows that it's not true, so that he had this, maybe it was a kind of luck, I don't know, or a kind of coincidence of several circumstances, but that on the one hand he did control to an extreme amount the reception, but on the other hand there was also a kind of reception that was completely free. I mean, we talked yesterday about the review by Rainer Banham. Mm-hmm. You see that he doesn't care, he really does his own thing, and he disregards almost everything, almost misreads the book. So Koolhaas had this, I don't know if it's a talent or a kind of luck, to on the one hand control the reception, but on the other hand also to have a kind of free flowing reception that goes in all directions.
Yeah, well, I wonder about this control. I don't pretty much. I mean, isn't that the Koolhaasian trick to pretend after 50 years of career that you controlled everything? I mean, at the same time, I was more impressed by the fact that so many people wrote about it, and that has also more to do with who the hell writes about architecture today. I mean, if you make a building now, I mean, if you have one article against or for the building, I mean, that's already quite something. But they're going, I mean, it's quite remarkable that already from the very beginning, perhaps, of course, because of Delirious New York being published in English, there's already an international audience, even though there's no buildings yet. And then you see, in a way, on the Kunsthal and the VAI, or even the Hague before, there's a big Dutch audience, but also audience of many different kinds of people. I mean, intellectuals, but also simply journalists in newspapers. Something which I'm not even so sure has to do a lot with Koolhaas. It's also to do a lot how times have changed in terms of how important architecture is in a culture. I don't know.
No, but even then, I often wondered when compiling this book, is there, disregarding the oeuvre of Koolhaas, is there another architect from the same generation, or let's say from the second half of the 20th century, that you could, on whose work you could base a similar critical reader? And the answer is, probably no.
Well, you mean exactly the same time, or?
No, I mean.
But I mean, there's been thousands of articles written about James Stirling. I mean, if you would start to dig that, I mean, there's really many, and by Banham and that's or supporters, but about many of the buildings, whether it was in Germany or England, whether they were fitting or not fitting, collapsing or not collapsing, and so forth. I mean, I'm not so sure about that.
No, but is it? Yeah, maybe the specificity lies in the sort of covering of the field that. I mean, the diversity of voices that you could say that in the case of Stirling, there were kind of architectural writers that probably wouldn't consider writing about Stirling, but if you sometimes want for Koolhaas as well, is there if there is at least anyone that was more or less active as an architectural writer in the second half of the 20th century addressed the problem of Koolhaas.
Christophe, there I have to say you're the specialist, you see. I mean, because I did not check the full list here.
What I can add is that I have the impression that some of the, a major part of the authors that you selected, or the texts that you selected, come from magazines who do not longer exist. still exists, but it's completely changed, and we cannot have any profound articles in it anymore. Although I'm guilty, and I also wrote one article in it. I tried to do something, but it's so difficult in the format that they give you. AMC, as it was in Architecture Mouvement Continuité, as it was in Paris in 1960s, 70s, 80s, is not there anymore. Wonen THBK Archis, we talked about it this afternoon, is not there anymore neither. So I do have the impression that within the culture of architectural publishing and architectural criticism, things change. Does not mean that it is the only criterion, but I think it's an important one.
And isn't it like that? But then again, that maybe just now shows that I didn't read your book yet profoundly well, but at least the parts I read Dutch authors, I read some Belgian authors, which were early in the Dutch party, so to speak. I read French authors, and I read Anglo-Saxon authors, which were, of course, in the circle post Johnson, whatever, Eisenman, the gang. So these are the groups I saw. But then again, and of course, then later towards the end of the book, you see the people who typically wrote about international architecture at that time. So I thought I almost read the opposite. For me, it was very local. It was extremely local in a way, with not one, but 2, 3 bubbles. I mean, I read hardly any, say, Italian theoretical people from that era. I mean, not at all. I mean, again, maybe I skipped a few. I'm not so sure. I had the feeling he had from quite early onwards. I mean, and in that sense, I found it interesting that you brought in the Spearhouse article at the beginning. So you have Eisenman, who kind of simply discovers that collage together with Paul Rudolph and who else was there. I mean, there's New York, so there's people in that circle. There's New York, which Midcoast Johnson at least partly sponsored it, right? So you know that voices come from that era, and that Banham writes against it is also not so strange from that perspective. And then you have the Dutch wave, where he all of a sudden arrives, and people don't know what to do with it. And you see it with people who became later important people in culture, like Johnny Rodermont or people like that, who kind of either embrace, don't embrace. And then you have, of course, our Geert Pekaert, who, I mean, is one of the first voices who actually critically, together with Von Moos, I would say, embraces, and then perhaps Lucan, who embraces, but really with a bit more distance. But Von Moos you can understand, because he was often in Holland at the time. Well, it was shown because he's speaking Dutch in the article. Pekaert was looking for a new hero, and perhaps Lucan was the only one who kind of discovered him a little bit. I mean, in a sense. I mean, because he was distant enough. So I'm not so sure. Ultimately, you see it's a small bubble.
I think in terms of quantity, you'd find architects who have more articles on their work, like more the formalists, late 20th century architects that were always in every architectural journal, or people who geared more towards a public audience. But I think how can you hear me? Is this microphone working? Yeah. How I think, especially because he wrote a book, a book or books before he said, "I am an architect." Now he positioned himself even as an indicator of culture in general, and the people who wrote about him wrote about his buildings as indicators of the condition of society. And I think that's why there may be not more texts on Koolhaas, but they're more ambitious in what they want to say.
Yeah. Maybe before we go into detail, one final, what you could consider a paradox. Another paradox is that he is, as we also saw in the movie fragments, he was always, and the project as well, quite brutal and well, arrogant, as the word always was already used. You could consider that, well, on the one hand, it's a kind of behavior for an architect, or that has become quite rare, in the sense that, well, like all cultural producers, you have to be somewhat polite. But the paradox is that, of course, also this brutality was probably also what created the kind of exposure and the kind of reception.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I think that was certainly his strategy. I think and for him it worked out. But he was also backed, I guess. No, he was backed in the AA from the beginning onwards. He was backed when he was in New York. He was backed by Ungers. He was backed by many people. So he had, I think, the feeling at least that from the perspective of architectural discourse, or at least there was a certain legitimacy to what he was proposing. He was often backed by people who were not fully agreeing with what he said, but were fascinated by how he was twisting what they had said before, and how perhaps he would announce a future of everything they had been developing earlier on. So he was not simply backed by people who said he says the same as what we say, but he is about to say something which we would never say, but we somehow are fascinated. So that was a quite particular position, whether it was Zengeris in the beginning, or it was Ungers. Well, you read it also with his Charlottesville tapes, whether it's Stern, whether it's, Eisenman. There were many of these people who from day one saw in him an announcer of what could come, no? I guess that feeds your arrogance to a certain extent. I don't know.
You want to react? No, I think it is one part of an explanation. I kind of follow you. Maybe I can complement with a completely different story, because I'm wondering if this kind of arrogance is something that is created by the audience, the public, the critics, created by Koolhaas, but towards the public. Because in my very few experiences with Koolhaas, the first ones going back to 2004, I was of course very nervous when I was going to meet the guy, and he was very fast annoyed, but it was not arrogant. He was just thinking very, very rapidly, so you had to be very, very quick, even quicker than him, in order to be able to talk with him. So that's one thing. And second is that when we were working on both books, the book that Christophe showed, but also the one on the Dutch Embassy in Berlin, what I thought was quite interesting is that he really wanted to get triggered by the people around the table, by me, for instance, with a selection of names that he didn't have heard of, or he thought of inviting people that would critically analyze his work instead of the usual suspects that would kind of go in the same direction as the one that he was already promoting. So in a sense, I think that I don't know if this arrogance is a real arrogance, or is it a kind of very fast way of thinking and of being wanting to be triggered by a lot of things very rapidly. And that's what I saw a couple of years ago when I was in a jury of the students of Harvard, where they had to work on the exhibition that will be presented next year in the Guggenheim on the countryside, where he was completely fascinated by the work of the students and he wanted to kind of get most out of it. So in his relationship with students, because they are of a different generation and because they are dealing with new things, I had the impression that there was not an arrogancy, but a kind of very porous person who wanted to absorb as much as possible.
Yeah, but still, there are interviews in the book in which he talks about Aldo Rossi, for example, and he says, Milde Koning asks, you can easily in the Galatarese building close a window, and then Koolhaas sort of responds by saying, I don't believe that for a second. So, he had this kind of very, certainly in interviews, this outspoken view on his colleagues, which was quite rare, I think. Well, which is certainly rare nowadays, but which was at the time already this kind of positioning of an architect, choosing your enemies and then also acting on fighting with those enemies.
I think it's rare nowadays, you're probably right with that. I don't know, of course I didn't live 30 years ago as an active architect. I had always the impression it was very common back then. Yeah. If you read these Klotz tapes, the special issue of, what is it, architect, Archbruce, that's it? Yeah. Well, you read exactly that. Well, first of all, that Koolhaas is an arrogant salesman to the point it's surreal. He tries to convince Klotz to get models from him and this and that. It's very funny. But he's also not the only one. Denise Scott Brown, Norbert Venturi, the way they desperately try to get whatever drawing there, and the way they dismiss him the moment he considers maybe also getting a drawing of somebody else. I don't remember, was it Rossi, was it Heyduk or something? It sounds all quite familiar to me. I think a lot has changed in the architecture scene in that regard. I don't know.
But is it so different, Kersten, today?
Yeah, I think so. Well, at least.
Because I think that you also sometimes express who are the architects that you like and don't like, but maybe it's not in public fora anymore.
Yeah, I
because
think
public
it's
fora
much less
don't-
public, I guess, yeah. I don't know why it does. Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that the public has so much mutated that the moment you say something, it multiplies. I guess, you know, to discover how Koolhaas was speaking in a lecture through the cloth tapes, then you know that in a way it was a very small circle and it was, you know, nobody else was aware of it. Whereas now you know that if I say hear something, you probably record it. Be careful. So I think a lot has changed in our relationship towards media and its proliferation. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to soften all your statements, neither, huh, Christophe?
No, it's no problem at all. Maybe we should direct our attention to architecture now and to see what was specific about the architecture of OMA in general and of certain projects in particular, and that created a kind of critical reception. Kersten, is there one building that you would pick out, or that when confronted with the book, that sort of
Well, when confronted with the book, for me, a building was really hard, and I mean, you already showed visually the building I like, especially the one we're building at the moment. No, obviously, because I did write indeed that article in your OASE issue on that building, and I very much was keen on doing that. And it's even true that when I went through the book first, I wanted to figure out how many articles were written about it, and at least in the ones you had selected, surprisingly few. I was surprised. I was very, very surprised by that. I think there's only Herman van Heemskerk, how is it called, Herman Verkerk article in there, which somehow defends the building, and all the rest is always related immediately to the Kunsthal, in some sense, or at least that's how I remember it reading it. I couldn't find them. So I was surprised. So my question was even to you in relationship to that building. It seemed like ultimately we, or he, perhaps Koolhaas, created very much, I mean, the story of the Kunsthal after the NIE. I would have imagined there was a polemic similar to the one of the Hague, but I didn't find it in your book.
I think there were a few more texts than the one you mentioned. I think, again, for example, Bekart also wrote a similar
a little bit afterwards,
piece on like the one he wrote on the Hague City Hall, and it's also mentioned in texts that deal with the period and in interviews. The interview with Miel de Koning, for example,
this
shows his anger about.
True, but that's they were less. Whereas with the Hague situation, I don't know. I was already thinking. Apparently, the Hague was a hotter thing already than an architecture museum, where perhaps nobody cared so much about ultimately. So it was already a little bit. I mean, because it was the same people, right? It was the same protagonist. It was even the same wethouder of the Hague who decided against the OMA project later. So I'm not sure. So it's not an answer to your question which project all of a sudden came up in this book. Okay. But it was almost like the other way around. I had that project projected on the book, and as much as I loved the book, I was a bit disappointed. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Now,
and what exactly made you construct, well, to repeat the joke once more, construct this building 30 years after the fact? What is so, why is this design so particular for you?
Well, maybe that's what I also wanted to answer to you about which project would come out in the book. What I realized by reading the book, that the fragmented nature of, you know, this set of interviews, articles, comments, sometimes about many buildings, sometimes about one, as you have the book here. It made me realize that my reading of OMA is exactly that. It's almost like as if I never, as a student, for a long time, and I had to pick up here in our office the A+U from '88. I mean, which was there. I mean, I could perhaps taken also an architecture d'aujourd'hui of a bit earlier, '85. But I picked up the A+U to actually reorganize certain of my, say, images according to project. And for me, let's say the first decade, because that was very much the part I was reading in your book. Like how did you have the subtitle? There is hope or something? I don't remember.
Hope has returned.
Hope has returned. Yeah, kind of post-Star Wars title or something. Yeah. Hope has returned. You know, I was fascinated exactly by this. That for me, it was a part of Bompius and a part of the NIE, and a little bit of the Morgan Bank, and then yet a little bit of, what is it, even the police station, which was in many ways terrible, and then the memory of the shell of the bus stop in Rotterdam. And all these things, they created something of an idea of an architecture, which is far before, say, Bigness. So it's a very different architecture, which was deeply influential for us, or for me, but not because there was one particular project I so much understood, because they were always so badly kind of documented. And I remember also having that experience when I wanted then finally to write about the NIE, that was like, yeah, what was it, 2 collages of a facade, like a plan and a half, and a model picture. That it was very much kind of a suggestion of a project, which only if I extrapolated through all the other projects I thought I knew. I mean, it's another very good example. It's a building without a facade, really. So it's very strange. So you had to look at another project again to project the facade. So this for me is that period, and that's what attracted me very much. Well, as a student and still today. And then to answer your question, and of course it's only one half of the office speaking here, because I guess the crematorium has many kind of, how to say, I look for the English translation, ontstaansmythes, kind of, well, myths of its origin. And of course only share a few. When I say yes, the NIE was a very, very big part of it, but it was of course also intriguing to realize that you could make a tilted roof which was square as opposed to the triangle. So I mean, for me, loving OMA had always to do with the fact that you could immediately make the next step, that you do not have to love the object as such, even to a certain extent with very successful projects like the Kunsthal, which come later. Yeah, it's a building which you do not you cannot simply reduce it to 1 or 2 ideas. So I mean, it's very fertile, and that counts very much for this early work. I mean, it's simplistic sometimes, but it's so confusing that it's immediately the beginning of another project. And that's really my relationship. I don't know. I mean, I see you looking full of disbelief. So please.
No, I don't have the same talent as you as an architect, so I'm not going to. No, I don't look at the project in that sense. But you mean, is it then really a sort of?
No, give you an example. Sort of I mean, the Morgan Bank. I know. I always loved the Morgan Bank. But what do I know about the Morgan Bank? I know nothing about the Morgan Bank. I know at most that it's a corner, it's an open corner, and it has a marble facade, I think. And then I look back and I say, there's a here or there collage, I think shows that. And then there's things which I don't know about this Morgan Bank. I remember as a young student, I've been forever desperately trying to look in Amsterdam for this Byzantium, which is this terrible building complex in the end, to find it ultimately and to be utterly disappointed, I admit. Because the Byzantium, I imagined it was clearly another building. And I for a long time thought that this double twisted tower, what was his Churchill plan or something, was actually built, and I couldn't find it. And I mean, so for me, many of these projects, they have this kind of strange, I would say, hallucination-like quality.
Related to the
maybe I'm a bad reader.
No, is it? I'm wondering if it's related to the potential of the graphic representation or the material representation, because there were a lot of collages that were used to kind of suggest a kind of thickness and work on the facade, but there were no facades. The same was for the Nederlands Theater, as the collages were made in the office. So I think that there's maybe all the perspective drawings that I know from the Morgan Bank and other projects of that time suggest a lot of things, but don't completely show them. And maybe there's the potential for you as an architect.
And there's, I think, there's always a fragmented nature of the material. For example, it took me a long, long time, I'm not exaggerating, to understand, because I didn't read these texts back then, I was a student, I looked at images, that there was actually the dance theater in Scheveningen, and then actually the real one in The Hague. And I didn't understand there were two projects. It took me a really long time. And I at first thought, are they not two versions of the project? Or then I was in The Hague at the time, and I wasn't even sure where the project of Koolhaas started or stopped, because there was this kind of weird glass volume to it, and I was like, is this now part of the project or not part of the project? And in some strange way, he allowed you to be confused. And I think is very different, by the way, that OMA, that Koolhaas, from the current one. Because he's so much, I mean, call it nostalgia, call it representing the city, call it, kind of obsession with collapse and the kind of fucked up state of mind of the at that time the metropolitan citizen, but it somehow allowed for this kind of somewhat unfinished projects, which were though formally very precise. And that makes them so totally, that makes them so easy, if I may say so, to kiss them alive.
Sabine, I think you selected, or sort of, read something about the Kunsthal?
I can continue. You're talking about this moment that something is not fully defined, so it triggers it triggers your imagination, and I think that's what we all love in these collages, right? And then now we're talking about the text. So you gave us this task: choose a building and then choose one text that is especially good or bad, or somehow we have something to say. So I think exactly because there is a lot of fiction and projection that we work with in media when we look at images and read. I think as a critic, it's really a question of ethics that you see the place and you don't narrate the story that someone tells you about a building, a place, a space, but you see it and you experience it. And so this is, I think, why I thought I have to choose a building where I've actually been, and not all of them, not as many as you, and also one that is public, because then I, as a critic, I'm the eyewitness that has walked through the building, but also, especially when you work for a public medium, I think it's very important that the people can also engage. And so I think buildings that are open to the public are much more feed discourse much better, because I think everyone should go and make their own opinion. And so I actually picked three. I think that you're also, now we're kind of giving you feedback on your book, but we're also telling you what you will find in the book. And so I picked three texts that I will briefly comment on. And so with the Kunsthal, because it's the first kind of building that was widely received, and it has a like, I'm sure these are not all of them, but it has a lot of texts on it already here. And I think it's interesting how the ones that were written briefly after the opening, how they, in reading them in this sequence, when you read 10 texts about the same building, how obviously they're written for a different audience. I thought this moment between the texts written for the architect by Ed Mellett, whom I don't know. So he goes on and on about how this detailing, and obviously I was also there when in the 90s, the students, we could talk for hours about how important detail it is, or how important it is not to detail, too detailed. And this whole detail thing is going on here for 4 pages. And it's kind of, by now, 20 years later, we can say this is completely obsolete discussion. But at the time it was vibrant, so that's why it's so long. And I think this is definitely something that architects wanted to read and no one else. And then you cut to The Guardian, Dejan Sucic, and who the text that's called The Museum is Megastar. It's super sharp, and it's not about Koolhaas, the megastar, but really about this medial attention. And the Kunsthal becomes this indicator of the universe at this moment in time. And so the references are really different. So in this text, Sucic, he uses mies, but then I always thought here he uses mies just to use something that is to do with architecture. He doesn't really, probably not actually know that much about mies, but it's not important. It serves its purpose in this text. So I think just the proximity of this text and reading them basically together is also very valuable for thinking what texts should do in public discourse. And then I think the text so there are all these texts from from the immediate moment when it was new, and a lot of kind of eyewitness reports that are sometimes not that deep or that intelligent, but they tell something to the public. And then 4 years later, that's your last text, which I think you probably also selected as kind of a concluding text. 4 years later, Cynthia Davidson, the editor of Any magazine, writes in her own journal about the building. And what she does, the text, it's this I think it's written by a woman, and she goes, I walked to the building, I did. Like, it's really this I perspective. Like, there's a big debate, can you use I or not in history?
Cynthia can use I. She can do everything.
Yeah, she can. But yeah, so I think also, yeah, she definitely does it over. She does it to the extreme here, and she visits it once, and she walks through. Koolhaas guides her. Then she starts over the second time. Then she chooses her own path. But it's I think she does it very well. But she really does it at the extreme that she's extremely present in this text. And I think if you do it, if you put yourself as the author's present in the text, you have to do it well. And so I think she does it well. But then she does not. It's more than she does only the eyewitness thing. She only does to actually then come to this super theory at the end. What else would she do in any magazine? So the whole thing ends up in this like universal super theory of the 20th whatever century. So just to show you, this is the last text, and I think also I think it's an interesting text because it does both. It gives you the walk through the building, but it also places it in a theoretical discourse, which I think are pretty much the two ends where all these texts oscillate in between. Yeah. It's very rewarding to read these all kind of in this mix, in this kind of, it's like you're in a mall and there are like 10 restaurants and you have the smells of like 10 different cuisines, and each of them does something and some do more than others.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true that there was some work of composition involved in making the book, and I deliberately tried to show a diversity of text genres. So there is one, the shortest text is this interview of 4 or 3 questions and 3 answers that was published in Andy Warhol's Interview.
I read the short text first, so I read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. And there are other, there are, you could say, very serious texts. There's one text that follows, I think, in the composition immediately on this, you could say, somewhat very exalted text by Geert Beekaert, or actually it's before, which ends actually with this sentence, "Hope has returned," because we have now Rem Koolhaas. But it is preceded by a very short text written by a guy I didn't know, but it's in a Rotterdam journal called Hard Working, and he sort of writes the same, but in a much more simple way, by saying he literally writes, we are dying here of boredom. So he really asks a kind of new kind of architecture for Rotterdam. So these contrasts are certainly part of the composition of the book.
How far did you go in retitling the essays? Because the titles read like their own story.
I took the liberty to retitle the texts. Yes. Yeah. Not well. That's what an editor does, I guess. But no, not always, but sometimes often texts are without real title. It was actually, now I realize, an answer to your question. It's also by this, I hoped that having these different titles now and then justified the absence of, or at least already in the title you can sort of show what will happen in the text.
Shall I do now? I walk twice a week in Lille from the Euralille train station to the metro, and I really was hesitant of talking about that and only my experience. As I'm very much interested in the crossover between architectural practice and theory and writing, I decided to talk about SML-XL. I watched a couple of weeks ago this conference by Rem Koolhaas that he did at the AA school, the 29th of November, 1995. It is on YouTube, so everybody can go and see it, in which, with this kind of enthusiasm of the very young child who presents the first drawing to its parents, he presents this book. In the book didn't have... Should I stop?
It's just Disco Light.
Disco Light. Well, the book at that time, in November 1995, was not published yet. It was only being published in December. And so Koolhaas went to the AA school with this kind of slideshow with a lot of disco lights as well. And with a kind of very big enthusiasm, he tried to explain to the audience what the book was about. Of course, the book has been analyzed a lot of different ways as the last manifesto, as the last monograph, as the last form of operative criticism. It has been analyzed in quantity. Read over and over again. There's some confusion on the number of pages, 1,346 or 76, 60,000 or 70,000 words, 1,200 images, 33 projects, 17 essays by Koolhaas, 5 years of work I read between Koolhaas and Bruce Mau, 3 feet high stack of correspondence between both of them, and of course the idea of a book as a kind of joint project. Before coming here and before actually receiving the book, I have been reading a lot of essays written to celebrate the 20th anniversary of SML-XL in the Journal for Architectural Education, published in 2015, where I was kind of disappointed by all the authors, and we know of some of these authors in that journal, and the journal is considered a good journal, disappointed of the lack of ambition that these authors had of critically examining the book. They all talked about this book as a brilliant book, as a kind of book that questions the idea of the book itself, that questions the idea of architectural criticism, etc., etc., etc. But it didn't go beyond. And so I was really eager when I received the book of Christophe to dive into your selection, and I was very happy that you decided as SML-XL was actually on the same level as some of the build projects. You took the liberty of putting SML-XL and the Generic City as 2 important projects, making one last chapter on the same level as Euralil and Congrexpo. I think it's an important gesture to show that the architectural practice is actually defined both by output in the form of a book and output in the form of built work. And then I started reading, and then I was almost always again disappointed when I started picking out some things. Irene Scalbert, I thought it was going to be a very kind of bright text because I really like him as a critic, and I thought he was very good in his criticism, but he didn't go beyond judging the kind of book. And then, luckily for me this afternoon, and also a couple of days ago, I remembered that Bart Eekhout wrote this text. Bart Eekhout, who is not an architectural critic, he is a professor in English and American literature, teaching at the university in Antwerp, but also part of this bizarre kind of group that was organized at the university in Ghent called the Ghent Urban Studies Team, GUST. They organized a conference or a big congress in 2000 and actually produced 2 very interesting books on the city, on the metropolis. And this text, I thought it was, and I'm looking for my notes, I thought it was quite amazing, but because what he did, what he did is that he took the format of the Generic City text by Koolhaas, which is made in different paragraphs and sub-paragraphs, and which gives, of course, the author, Koolhaas, in 1995 and Bart Eekhout in 1996, when he wrote the text, the liberty of putting things together that are not actually in a logical sequence. And he took the same liberty as Koolhaas while writing his text. A text that was published in the Nieuwe Wereld tijdschrift, if I'm correct, but you can help me. It's a magazine dedicated to literature that was, and other stuff, but and to culture, but it was edited by Herman de Koning, a poet, and that very much searched for opening up new roles for literature as a critique on society. That's how I kind of understood it. So I was very happy that this text by Bart Eekhout was published in this magazine. And what he does is that he starts by recalling the conference that Koolhaas gave in Ghent in 1996 in an audience where maybe you were already present. You were present. Yeah. Present as well.
I hated it, but I was there.
You were a child. Where there were 1,200 seats available, and where Koolhaas, it is mentioned in his text, says, "Why am I being questioned here exclusively by architects? Whereas my book is a novel." That's how Bart Eekhout also starts a bit the text. A book that strikes us first and foremost by its potent, unwillingness to select, he says. Bart Eekhout is this, saying that as a novel, it is not at all a novel, and so he's kind of deconstructing the way how Koolhaas is making SMLXL in saying that Koolhaas does not choose at any moment which kind of narrative he will take, which kind of project he will put in, which kind of text he will publish. And it is the kind of quantity that is important. Anything and everything, says Bart Eekhout. Interruptions of narratives are very important, and they create a kind of effect of discontinuity. I'm doing actually this kind of promotion for this text, because I think if there's one text that you need to read, it's that one. Irony, distraction, confusion, he says. Indifference is it a kind of effect that gives this kind of interruptions. He says that SMLXL, in this, I thought it was quite interesting, is a kind of workpiece. A think tank wishing to reproduce in the reader the same state of uncertainty as the architect, Koolhaas, must have had while making projects and while making the book. And that I thought was a kind of interesting thing. So it's not the next novel, it's not the last monograph, it's not a kind of manifesto or last manifesto of the 20th century. It is maybe this kind of workpiece. I thought it was kind of interesting. Bart Verschaffel, philosopher Bart Verschaffel, a professor at the University in Ghent, said at that same moment, and Bart Eekhout is quoting him in the text, that it is a dangerous book as well. A book that is not very much delimiting or limiting what you could see through architecture, but it's superposing different things. And then as a kind of literary critic, Bart Eekhout goes on and is kind of deconstructing rhetoric, the idea of doing the and tick, tick, tick. Bigness is where architecture is mostly seen, and bigness is where architecture is the most and the least architecture at the same time. This kind of idea of the use of rhetoric, the idea of the use of authorship, and of questioning authorship and questioning even the readability of the text. He says that some parts of the project of the Euralil and Congrexpo are completely incomprehensible because of the graphic design by Bruce Mau. The book, he says, should actually not have been a book because there were other ways of making all these efforts public through to a kind of digital environment that was raising in the middle of the 1995. But he says Koolhaas chooses for a book because he is very much attached to this idea of the book. And maybe it's this last kind of idea of nostalgia, of what Koolhaas always says, that he is an anti-nostalgic author. He continues about the narrative forms that are there, about style, and actually the very clear and conscious choice not to create a style, and not to create a kind of editorial style with the book, as a reflection of not creating any style with his projects. He goes on about the ability to identify the architectural paradigms of our age, very important in the work of Koolhaas, I think, and the way how meta-narratives on cities like Atlanta, Singapore, and others were very much important. And he concludes with a kind of coda, saying that the book is everything and nothing, and it's a title that you took back in your collection of essays. A book about everything and nothing at the same time, and a book that reinvented itself. But he leaves actually open what was actually set in the whole book. So I thought that if an architectural critic should write something about an architectural book or project, he could probably read or probably learn something from the way how this text was composed, because it really dives completely into the subject, and at the same time it decomposes it in order to kind of grasp what we can learn from it. So.
Yes, so it's true that it's a remarkable text written by a literary scientist, but now just as a question, is it not and also to maybe criticize the final part of, not of the book, but of the period of OMA that is covered in the book, is it also not a problem of small, medium, large, extra large, that it takes literary critics to review it incisively? I mean, one of the things that becomes present in the book is that Koolhaas has constantly tried to push the limits of architecture, and maybe with small, medium, large, extra large, it was enough. So he maybe already went a little bit too far. And I'm also thinking of, I mean, I don't want to limit what Kersten, what you, or maybe the generation of architects you are part of are doing, but there is a disciplinary definition of architecture that is certainly a reaction to this kind
but as I said, I mean, I absolutely hated the book, and especially that event which Véronique talks about. I was in that event. I mean, I thought what Bart Verschaffel said there, I couldn't stand it. I mean, well, the text you're quoting and the yes or no nostalgia, I found it repulsive. I could really not relate to it in a sense that for me that was the end of architecture. I mean, and in a sense it very much pushed me, and I think not just myself, but in another direction. Whereas I think we were on that kind of, I don't know, plane with him, and we thought, wow, this is really exciting. And I mean, the destination turned out to be not what we were looking for. And that's also why every time I'm looking through your book, I didn't even yet dare to look in the last half of it. I mean, I will probably do in the end, it's interesting, but it's not there where I find, call it inspiration. Sorry to sound so pathetic, but no, and I mean maybe as a what? Sorry.
Yeah, I recommend, because could we say that when you find inspiration in the first decade, it is because of some compositional elements, both within the plan, within the section, within forms of representation. And what I've always found interesting in SML-XL, and I'm really happy that you chose the text by Lie van de Kouter, the flip forward, is the fact that he is making this jump towards the analysis of the built environment, and not about architecture but about the city. And actually SML-XL is much more about other things than about architecture.
Sure, journalism I would dare to say. And the funny thing is, sorry, I don't want to abuse your bridge, because I was very fascinated you say this, because I think for me that was the problem, journalism, to the point that, I mean, then 10 years later, if not more than that, when we made this after the party, so to call, I mean, that was exactly a reaction to that. I mean, it was probably not his book, which was like that. I mean, not his texts, which were so beautifully written that, I mean, they were interesting enough. But ultimately, it was the kind of feedback of all this, which we felt we had to deeply react against. I mean, I will use after the party in a minute as a bridge, but you wanted to say something else.
Well, I'm just wondering what is the kind of relevance of whatever we are doing. The relevance of art here this afternoon or this evening, the relevance of a book, the relevance of the work of OMA, the relevance of, again, looking towards the project of the first and the second decade, etc., etc. If we are in a kind of position where, and I think that there's still a lot of students in the room, we are questioning what the role of architects and architecture can be this kind of era that we are seeing. And then I think that text like the generic city, like the things on Atlanta or Singapore, etc., can give a kind of incentive, and I don't feel them as, how do you say it, depressing, as you were talking about.
It's about
junk space. I don't think that these ones are so depressing, so I think it is good material to kind of start a discussion on the role of architecture.
Sure, but I still have to bring my text. I'm sorry, I know you want to discuss. I mean, or I'm supposed to. I mean, not. I mean, it's short. Don't worry. before everybody walks away.
Yeah, no, it's true.
No, because look, no, I think perhaps a little bit by accident, but it's so well chosen. You know, you have the Kunsthal, we have SMLXL, and in a sense, of course, I completely I run back in time, and I was very much thinking like which text should I choose, and it's I think also I choose a short text because that one I could read. I mean, but at the same time, and I did not take a text of Geert Beeckhaert, which I perhaps would have taken if I was honest towards my own introduction to Koolhaas. I think the TLBK text was extremely important, which has a beautiful title, which he did not change. And how is it called again? The Enlightened, the Odyssey of the Enlightened Entrepreneur or something. Which is a fantastic title, I think, towards his work. I took this very strange little text, which, while you named Puritanical Hedonist, which was an interview he did with Franco Raggi, which is very, I don't know if it was the title or not.
I didn't retitle all of the text.
Okay, but maybe that was the real title.
I think it was the real title,
okay. No, but it doesn't matter, because it's an odd text, and it's kind of, it starts with a kind of rather provocative conversation about sex movies, which I skip. Yeah, I skip because I mean it's funny. I think it's more anecdotal towards his background of sex movie maker, or at least his claim of being. Because I think the claim is a little bit bigger than the actual act. I mean, semi-claim. But then I thought it was a very interesting text because it's an interview, only 2 pages long, which I would say in a few questions and a few answers, you so clearly understand at that time in '83. His position. I thought it was absolutely wonderful, and I will not even read the answers per se because I think often the questions were the best. I mean, his answers are also good, but I will only read the last answer. So if I skip the sex, so to speak, so then I mean they're very direct questions. You know, it's like what is your relationship with citation in architecture, and so I mean very interesting. And then the next question is, well, in that case, wait. No, it's about nostalgia. Where am I? Here. So do you think nostalgia can be a progressive philosophy? Why does he ask that question? Because actually Koolhaas then confesses to be into nostalgia as opposed to claims later. And so then he says, yes, that's not very modern. And then they have a bizarre quarrel about the modern when Koolhaas claims, yeah, but wait a second, it's you who brings up the word modern. So I think very interesting relationship with the modern. And then if I step a little bit further, I think probably I should immediately move to what do you take on the contemporary city? And do you see a decline in the ability to conceive the city? Or to which he says, no, I see a decline in the ability of architects to understand the city. Then what is there to understand about the city? And so then there's a whole argument about the of conflict to a certain extent. And then the last, or the one before last question I bring up is that what party is it that's over now? And I think that's why I liked it very much, but also because he very clearly defined himself in opposition to what he considers the party of an architecture that has social and aesthetic legitimacy with a powerful design, but the atmosphere after a party has its attractions and architecture can interpret it. Which is very interesting in how he turns a criticism into an aesthetic to a certain extent, to where I bring in the last question, what is avant-garde today? To which he says, I don't know. And then, but you think it exists? And he answers, yes, but avant-garde isn't what's famous today, because one of the characteristics of the avant-garde should be that it's not digestible, while the theory today is that avant-garde has become a sort of popular behavior. It became acceptable. I still think it's important and possible to seek an acceptable position for the avant-garde, or in any case a position that's in conflict with the way things are. Otherwise I don't see how we can find the inspiration to be architects. If everything is perfect, what's the point of adding anything? I think, to me, honestly, in almost nothing I found what I find attractive about the figure, about the architecture. And it doesn't even fully engage on something specific, but I think it defines in a few questions and answers a cultural position, which, I mean, is what I keep from Koolhaas and which I started to resent with SMLXL, and which I think, whether it's Koolhaas or somebody else, which I think is still a valid cultural position in architecture today and which we should embrace. No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe there's still the possibility to open the discussion. If there are people who think we have made, want to correct mistakes we have made, or ask questions about the book or about Koolhaas, or things that we could have discussed but didn't, or personal anecdotes.
When I was with Koolhaas in the car, something like that. You killed them all.
Maybe your final remark on the avant-garde.
I'm sorry. What's the point of adding anything?
Okay, maybe Hans. I will give my. Hans van Dijk is a collaborator to the book as well.
Okay, I just for anybody who know who I am, I'm in the book. So and I know Koolhaas from very early on, even before Delirious New York, and there is a kind of intimacy, because I was a student assistant in Delft and he was teaching there, and he was teaching a studio that wanted to complete the Dutch Bijlmermeer, which was at that moment just going to be bashed and neglected, because it was at that moment about the worst post-war housing scheme that we had. That was the reputation. At that moment, he has written an article in Architectuur aujourd'hui about the Bijlmer as a kind of cliché of how bad the Dutch the housing, post-war housing was, and large-scale housing was, a kind of pre-ego of Holland. And then he started a studio in which he invited students who hadn't heard of him, not very much, just in the gossip circuit, etc. He was not famous at the moment, and he said, well, maybe you are critical on the Bijlmer, but as an architect you can only try to improve it. So finish it. It's we call it the strip. What the strip was for Las Vegas is the Bijlmer for the Dutch welfare state. So maybe that might be an inspiration. And he didn't accept any theory or closure or whatever. And that is one of the things that I also hear in your later comments. So there is an absolute separation of his writings, or what you may call his theory, and his work. If you didn't understand that, then you get, as a critic, you were criticized yourself. Right? It happened to me one time. I said, okay, he made the dance theater. I wrote an article, and I said, well, that is a little bit congruent with what he has written there and there and there. And I was listening to him, and I was sitting in the front row, and it was like hell, you know, that he criticized me. And later, when I read a piece of Milde Koning, which had, Rem, now in interviewing you, I think that even your good name in Holland is a little bit declining, but because I read that Hans van Dijk is critical on you, that Rem answered that as well. Hans van Dijk is one of the most clever and intelligent and nice critics, and he is absolutely certain of what he is saying, that he has a reason for that, etc. So it was very polite to defend me. But there is one thing in this whole thing, is that if you write and build, if you write and design, and there is a critic, or there are many critics who wanted to try to make a kind of connection or to explain one thing by the other, then he is absolutely resisting that. And I think that is also to save his own freedom and creative potential. But also that he doesn't want to be understood as a person who just has a theory. He is still always further than we are. It was my experience, but maybe he wanted also to be further than he is himself at that moment. So it is a kind of, maybe just a kind of cultural attitude that I think is very rare, and that is one of the reasons that I'm still interested in everything that he says today.
No, I think I agree that the desire to be never completely understood is, or sort of pinned down in words and in descriptions, is certainly typical for Koolhaas. I'm not sure if it might be rare for or strange for an architect, but it's as a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it is also what, well, strange comparison maybe, but also someone like David Bowie, for example. It is what a pop star or a sort of cultural icon is, constantly reinventing himself and not wanting to be fixed or to have this kind of fixed identity. Yeah, or a rock star. Yeah. So, I mean, in the case of Koolhaas, that also maybe explained, and that is maybe also a good thing to end with. A lot of people asked or still ask why the book ends with small, medium, large, extra large, and if there could be a book on the period from, let's say, the end of the 90s until now. Well, there are many answers to that question, but one of the things is that I always have had the impression that Koolhaas lost part of his interest in architecture with or following small, medium, large, extra large. Possibly also because he was forced by the success of his office and the size of his office to start doing things that he didn't like anymore. But it's sort of, yeah, there was a sort of devotion or a kind of attention to architecture that got lost and that is present in SML-XL already as well. Specifically in that reaction, in saying during that interview, why are architects reacting to my book? Other people should react to it. But yeah.
Do you think it lasts already 20 years?
I don't know. It's a. I don't know. It probably started with a small, medium, large, extra large, but it has increased during the years, I think. But it also has to do with it. Of course, it runs parallel to this constant desire to destroy the boundaries of the discipline of
I can only say I was really irritated in '95 because of this canonization of him as an architect, writer, author, whatever it was, when this event with 1,200 people happened in Ghent, where all the most important critics in Belgium were supposedly coming on the podium to talk about how intelligent the book was. I could absolutely not stand it. I mean, I just did not understand what was the story of this. I mean, if I would have been him, I would have certainly escaped and thought about my life for the next 5 years or something, which he probably did, as you say. But it was such a surreal event, and I'm sure there were other events of a similar kind in other places in the world, because I was only there, obviously. And it was even true that he arrived with his blue Maserati, which he then had, which he could not park, and he was hitting cars front and back. It was surreal. I mean, it was like everything about it was so far away from what he thought was, yeah, architecture. I mean, and maybe it was architecture, but it was of another scale, another logic, another time, another impact. I don't know. How do you survive that? I think you cannot survive.
So do you think that he contributed to his own kind of, how do you say this in English, demise, or by publishing SML-XL, he kind of orchestrated unconsciously the way he could never do what he did before? It was a kind of end of a period, clearly an end of a period.
Yeah, but I think it's also It may be sad to end on that note, but a sort of psychological condition. I mean, there is a quote I have in the introduction by Elias Zengelis, who collaborated for a long time with Koolhaas, saying that during the early years of OMA, Zengelis said to Koolhaas, "Why do we have found this set of strategies? Why can't we at least repeat them for, let's say, a few months?" And then Koolhaas was responding by saying, "No, we have to get ahead of being consumed and of getting repeated." But I think it's also probably, that's what you said, I think and that is, sorry for that, a kind of psychological interpretation, but his level of boredom is extremely low, in the sense that he gets bored very easily, and that sort of creates this desire to constantly do different things or to be on the lookout for other things. And that is possibly, for, I don't know if that is a good sort of physical condition or psychological condition to have a lifelong career as an architect. Or lifelong career to court, maybe. Yeah, well, that's maybe that can be the topic for another discussion. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Véronique, Sabine, and Kersten. Thank you all for coming. And final commercial remark: the book is available also in paperback and hardcover for special gifts for the holidays. Yes. Thank you.